Leftism. From Sade and Marx to Hitler and Marcuse. Erik von Kuehnelt-Leddihn. 1974. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Part 3. Liberalism. Chapter 13. Real Liberalism. Another grave, this time semantic misunderstanding between America and Europe lies in the concept of liberalism. In Europe, the significance of this term has also undergone several changes, but its essential meaning always has been kept. In the United States today, the word liberalism has a content diametrically opposed to its etymology, and to its original sense as understood not only in Europe but also in Latin America, Australia, New Zealand, the Soviet Union, Southern Asia, and Japan. In its process of deformation, the idea of liberalism has suffered nowhere more than in the United States, although a certain degenerative process of this term also has taken place in Britain. The liberalism preached by the Whigs at the beginning of the last century, the liberalism of Palmerston, of Asquith, of Lloyd George, and the younger Churchill, and obviously that of Mr. Ackland Hood, each have somewhat different meanings. Let us look at the verbal meaning. The root is liber, free. The term liberalis, and liberalitas, implies generosity in intellectual and material matters. The sentence "he gave liberally" means that the person in question gave with both hands. In this sense, liberality is an aristocratic virtue. An illiberal person is avaricious, petty-minded, tight-fisted, self-centered. Up to the beginning of the 19th century, the word liberal figured neither in politics nor really in economics. We explained the political content of the term in Chapter 5. While democracy answers the question as to who should rule, liberalism deals with the problem how government should be exercised. The answer liberalism gives is that regardless of who rules, government must be exercised in such a way that each individual, each citizen enjoys the widest personal liberty still compatible with the common good. Yet in spite of the fact that the common good can be willfully interpreted in the narrowest way, it is clear that liberalism rightly understood stands essentially for freedom. As far as our research goes, the first time this term was used in a political sense was in the year 1812, and the place of action not unnaturally, was Spain, a nation famous for its individualism, its inordinate sense of liberty, its strong anarchical drives. The supporters of the Constitution of Cadiz were called Los Liberales, and their opponents, among them the Apostolicos, were nicknamed Los Servals. Yet even at this very early stage of the game, a certain amount of misunderstanding had crept into the use of this term, inasmuch as the Constitution of Cadiz also had democratic features while the majority of the Apostolicos had federalistic, local rights, leanings which became even more marked when the Carlist Wars broke out and the liberals rallied around Queen Isabel II, who also enjoyed the aid of enthusiastic British volunteers. It took several years for this nomenclature to make its appearance in England. Southey used it for the first time in 1816 and, significantly enough, employed the Spanish form, speaking of our liberates. Sir Walter Scott, soon afterward, copied it from the French, referring to the liberals as libéraux. In the early 1830s, when after the reforms of Sir Robert Peel the new parties emerged, the Whigs became the Liberals and the Tories the Conservatives. This evolution was not surprising. Whigs and Tories were both aristocratic parties, as we have pointed out in Chapter 7, but the Whigs were more genuinely aristocratic in that they saw in the king a mere primus inter pares, whereas the Tories were the party of the Aulic nobility fawning in a rather unaristocratic way upon the monarch. At least this is the way the Whigs saw it. In other words, there is in all genuine aristocracies a certain republican undercurrent. The typical aristocratic state is always an open or a disguised oligarchic republic. This is borne out by Venice and Genoa on one side, and the Polish Commonwealth in Britain after 1688 on the other. The classic ally of the monarch is not the nobility or the clergy, but the burgher class. Only with the French Revolution do we see a radical and tragic change. Thus the idea of liberalism existed well before 1812. During the 18th century, an economic school was in the ascendancy, particularly in Britain and in the Netherlands, which, without straining our semantics, can be styled preliberal because it still did not use the liberal label. We are referring here to the Manchester School, whose philosophical, or theological, roots were deep in the soil of deism. God, the great architect, had created the world nearly perfect. All evils were due to human intervention which upset the divine plan. This could easily happen because this deist God had withdrawn from his creation. Neither priestcraft nor white magic, neither prayers nor other incantations moved him any longer. It was up to man to work out his own salvation, i.e., his terrestrial happiness, by interfering as little as possible, or, preferably, not at all, with the universe existing in a pre-established harmony which rested on divine laws. If state and society never intervened in commerce and industry, these would automatically flourish, while all artificial limitations, rules or regulations, for instance, guilds, labor laws, tariffs, currency reforms, etc., would bring about the downfall of prosperity. As Alexander Rusto has pointed out, there is a true theological background to the thought of Adam Smith and the entire Manchester school, a theology which has to be understood partly as a logical continuation of Calvinism, partly as its dialectical contradiction. In other words, there is in the ideology of Manchesterism and its laissez-faire a synthesis of John Calvin and the Renaissance. Of course, there is also a good deal of practical truth and common sense to this outlook. With its appeal to human egotism and ambition, the different schools of economic liberalism have delivered the goods much better than the various economic orders based on a pseudo-monastic collectivism and/or statism. At the same time, one ought to recognize that Manchesterism was a truly grand bourgeois ideology related to but not identical with Whiggery. The second phase of liberalism, which, indeed, bears the liberal label, we will call early liberalism. Though perhaps not entirely unaffected by deism, it had to a large extent the leadership of thinkers with decided religious affiliations or at least strong sympathies for the Christian tenets. This early liberalism reached its apogee in the 1850s, but its forerunners were active already in the 1820s and 1830s, while some of its exponents died around 1900. Let us name only a few of them in chronological order: Royer Collard, Alexis de Tocqueville, Montalembert, Gladstone, Jacob Burckhardt, Lord Acton. Half of them, significantly enough, were aristocrats. The others belonged to what is sometimes called the patriciate. Not a systematic thinker but a statesman of the same school is Count Camillo Cavour. Nor should one omit the name of Achille Léonce Victor du de Broglie. In other words, from a sociological viewpoint we are here faced with upper-class men, none of whom had an anti-religious bent. Jacob Burckhardt has to be styled an agnostic, but in his declining years he developed warm feelings for the Catholic Church. Did early liberalism have a forerunner? A man who inspired most of them? Inevitably one thinks here of Edmund Burke, not a pro-liberal, but certainly an early conservative who influenced de Tocqueville as well as Metternich. Many of these early liberals were not lovers of freedom besides being Christians but took their political inspiration either directly from scripture or from theology. As we can see, it was their religious anthropology, their picture of man which invited or forced them to walk the road of liberalism. Man has an immortal soul, man has a personality, man is not an accident of blind forces of nature. Man needs freedom because God wants him not only to develop his personality in the right direction but also to live a moral life, freely but rightly, choosing between good and evil. From the aforementioned it is obvious that the religious aspect of early liberalism was more strongly developed among Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, and those supporters of the Reformation faiths who had broken with the strict views of the Reformers, who were Erasmian and Zwinglian rather than Calvinistic or Lutheran. Among the names we have mentioned we do not find a single supporter of what is loosely called Protestant orthodoxy. Calvin and Luther certainly were not liberals in the decadent American sense, but they were not libertarians either. Libertarianism, that is to say true liberalism, in the Reformation faiths makes itself felt only in the 18th century as a result of the impact of the Enlightenment and of rationalism, both late descendants of the Renaissance and therefore alien in themselves to the spirit of the Reformation. The man in the street, to be sure, more often than not associates the Enlightenment, rationalism, and individualism with the Protestant outlook, if not with the Reformed religions. He knows nothing about the 180-degree turn the bulk of the Reformed faiths took 200 years ago, nor has he taken much notice of the return of a number of Reformed theologians to the orthodoxy of the 16th century, a relatively recent development which, so far, has not had the time, or the chance, to affect the faith of the masses. But whereas liberalism in the beginning received support from certain Catholic thinkers, its supporters were probably more numerous among the Reformed people. In the Catholic world the early liberal parties were small and largely composed of elites. Their economic thinking and economic considerations played a rather minor role, and early liberalism placed its emphasis on other sectors of human endeavor. It was different in the evangelical areas of Europe, where commerce and industry always occupied a more honored position than in the Orbis Catholicus, and where the ideas and notions of a very economic-minded proliberalism were still very much alive. Here we must bear in mind that the lacking prestige of the businessman in the Catholic world is due partly to the realization that the merchant is the representative of the only profession ever to have been physically chastised by our Lord. What a wonderful subject for our great painters in the past. St. Thomas Aquinas' views on the trader were frankly hostile, and modern capitalism rising in northern Italy in the 15th century had many technical and psychological hurdles to overcome. Double-entry bookkeeping was invented in the 15th century by Francis Luca Pacioli di Borgo, a Franciscan, but with the rise of Calvinism the center of business quickly shifted to the north. No wonder the Catholic renewal in the 19th and 20th centuries had certain bitterly anti-capitalist aspects. Nevertheless, it is interesting to see how rarely the early liberal thinkers were preoccupied with economics, whereas the next wave of liberalism, the old liberals, paleoliberals, to use the phrase coined by Frau Hetty Neumeister, became as intensively interested in economic problems as the proliberals. Early liberalism was characterized by a rather limited pragmatism. It was intuitive rather than scientific. Montalembert's thinking rested squarely on Christian premises. De Tocqueville, profoundly influenced by Madame Swetchine, who was also the great soulmate of Lacordaire, coordinated at a more advanced stage his political and social vistas increasingly with his reviving Christian faith. Jacob Burckhardt was deeply imbued with Christian ethics. It is indeed moving to see an agnostic solemnly choosing celibacy in his young years to be able to devote himself entirely to knowledge, research, wisdom, and truth. In the early liberals there is very little of that equation of freedom and usefulness prevailing among the proliberals and the old liberals of a slightly later period. The early liberals considered freedom as something to be treasured and defended because man needed it, because it was a postulate of a moral, not of a practical order, because, as many of them acknowledged, Christ had liberated us to liberty, Galatians, VL. An early liberal would hardly have shaken in his belief if somebody had proved to him that freedom is impractical, or expensive, or less apt to produce higher living standards than some effective form of slavery. Precisely because the early liberals were idealists in the narrow sense of the term, because their background was aristocratic or patrician, because they were intellectuals of a high order, without exception educated in the classics, because they founded their demand for freedom on religious and philosophical principles, they were not friendly toward democracy. As a matter of fact, most of them could frankly be styled anti-democrats. This, however, is often not fully realized by those interested in the history of ideas. Acton's remark to Bishop Creighton in a letter addressed to him in 1887, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely," is frequently cited by well-meaning Democrats who forget, or do not know, that Acton, quite an anti-democrat himself, would have applied this formula to parliaments or popular majorities without batting an eye. The mere fact that de Tocqueville wrote a standard work called Democracy in America, foretelling a further extension of democracy on a worldwide scale, has made him an apologist in the eyes of so many an American. But de Tocqueville was much too clever to believe that, with the coming upsurge of democracy, political history and its very changing forms would come to an end. He realized, we can be sure, that the world would outlive the democratic age, which he did not like at all. Yet he wrote in such a detached way that one has to read carefully between the lines. The man who, disgusted by the July Revolution of 1830, had left France for a United States, then under its first democratic administration, was not a Democrat. But, let us admit that even a few of his more intelligent readers were not quite sure where he actually stood. When once asked peremptorily about his convictions, he replied, "I have an intellectual inclination for democratic institutions, but I am instinctively an aristocrat, which means that I despise and fear the masses. I passionately love liberty, legality, the respect for rights, but not democracy. Liberty is my foremost passion." That is the truth. This is not the Alexis de Tocqueville known to the average American. Nor, to be sure, does the ordinary Swiss burgher, looking at a stamp featuring Jacob Burckhardt, realize how much this great man loathed democracy, as did Burckhardt's liberal friend, J. Bachofen, similarly honored by the Swiss Post Office. Outstanding men who have a certain pride in their experience or their knowledge are not likely to be admirers of democracy which refuses to distinguish between the various degrees of knowledge, is indifferent toward truth, as Berdyaev pointed out, and takes its stand on the basis of quantity and biological age rather than quality. In this system of government the votes are counted and not weighed, an observation Aristotle made well over 2,000 years ago. Indeed, it would be difficult to find in Europe more than a handful of truly outstanding thinkers who believed or believe in democracy. As a matter of fact, only Bergson and Maritain come to my mind, and Maritain joined the Democratic group only in his early 40s. Before that time he was fairly close to the Action Française. We mention Bergson only because in one of his philosophical works we find a passage hinting at his democratic convictions. However, he was strictly a philosopher and not in any way a political scientist. Naturally, one could produce a long list of literary men of the greatest talent adhering to democracy. Thomas Mann, who also had such friendly words for the Soviet Union, is a case in point. But literary people address themselves to a broad public, they are primarily artists and not systematic thinkers. The aversion of the early liberals for the two democratic postulates of equality and majority rule also had other important roots. They knew about the incompatibility between the liberal and the egalitarian principle. They saw very clearly that the enfranchisement of the masses would inevitably lead to the rise of political movements exploiting the envy of the many. They realized that the concept of the politicized nation was in itself totalitarian, a term then not known or used but clearly sensed and understood as in de Tocqueville's vision of the new tyranny to come. It was also evident to the early liberals that democracy would replace the search for truth in the light of reason with the mere whim, the emotions, the naked desires of the many expressed in numbers. Burckhardt spoke about dangers coming from political decisions based merely on the Gärung und der Völker, on the people's informant. Royer Collard no less than Montalembert emphasized the lights, les lumières, the quest for truth, which obviously is a task of the few but not of the many. They have neither the training, the time nor the money to get and to digest the information necessary for the judgments they have to make. Needless to say, moral qualifications are also necessary for one to arrive at decisions which demand immediate sacrifices ensuring a better future. Blood, sweat and tears can usually be promised only to a people with its back against the wall. Not all the early liberals were safe at all times in the face of the temptations of democracy which, as we have pointed out, has a paradisiacal character and all the lure of a clear but false idea. One has only to bear in mind that even Acton leaned temporarily toward democracy and that Constant de Rebecque also had a great moment of weakness when this brilliant essayist and politician suddenly decided to collaborate with Napoleon during his 100 Days. And yet nobody had written a better and more scathing analysis of the democratic French Revolution and the Bonapartist dictatorship than the early liberal Benjamin Constant during his exile. These things, unfortunately, do happen. Still, the early liberals are certainly non-democrats or anti-democrats, whereas their successors, the old liberals, had usually a philosophical and ideological outlook which predisposed them to view democracy in more positive terms. The main reason for this state of affairs is the strongly agnostic bent of the old liberals. Genuine liberals always wanted freedom. It is, however, precisely this quest for freedom which in certain minds started the idea that every firm conviction, every strong affirmation automatically results in intolerance. As we have pointed out in Chapter 4, the possibility of a truly convinced man's intolerance, and illiberality, exists. It is a hurdle, a temptation he has to overcome. Those, however, who do not believe in absolute truth or in the human ability to attain truth, are naturally not tolerant but merely indifferent. Still, the confusion between tolerance and indifference hardly bothered many old liberals who thought they could play safe by preaching a basically agnostic attitude, to use the word in a much wider than merely theological sense, and by waging a real intellectual and political crusade against all who believed in absolutes. These were decried as dogmatists. Such an attitude, as could be expected, put the old liberals all too frequently in opposition to Christianity and especially to Christian orthodoxy of any denomination. It is precisely this leaning towards agnosticism which facilitated the old liberals' armistice or even alliance with democracy. Democracy, as democratism, is an ideology, though in its simpler form it can also be seen purely as a system, as a mere procedure for producing, i.e., for selecting, a government. A democratic constitution offers a frame into which a picture can be fitted through the voting process. It is the majority vote which usually determines the character of the picture. Now, according to standard democratic doctrine, there are a few others. Every full citizen has the right not only to vote, but also to organize a party or to propose local candidates. The guardians of the democratic constitution have to adopt a neutral position toward all candidates, all parties, all ideas represented. One man is as good as any other man, one opinion as good as any other, all men and all opinions are invited to participate in the race, and he who wins numerically gets the prize. Democracy as an abstract principle has to insist on fair play, must express no preferences, and thus also has to give a break to parties which would put an end to the democratic order. If 51% or, better still, 2/3 of a people vote one or several anti-democratic parties into power, the end of democracy is at hand. In other words, democracy can commit suicide democratically. This quandary, this dilemma of democracy appears in many parts of the world. Italian law gives democratic rights to communists but not to fascists. The MSI is not exactly the successor of the old fascist party. In Argentina the real Peronists could not run for office either. They might actually have won as much as a good 1/3 of the votes in free elections. In short, democracy often distinguishes undemocratically between supporters of its own ideology and its adversaries, whereby the totalitarian aspects of democracy, perhaps tragically and unavoidably, become manifest. An ideal democracy does not discriminate. Fearful of violent dissent which rends asunder the fabric of state and society, It not only tries to be neutral but unknowingly considers an agnostic attitude to be the natural lubricant for the democratic process. Precisely here we find the golden bridge between old liberalism and democracy. People in a democracy should have tenuous party affiliations, their convictions should not be too well grounded, and their loyalties ought to be superficial. Otherwise they might always vote in the same way. A happy democracy of a liberal character where freedom survives, rests on change, however, not permanence. The citizens should be in the mood to switch their votes, and individuals, parties, and party leaders should always be ready to engage in compromise, in 50-50 arrangements which are the lifeblood of parliamentarianism. Here one should not overlook the coalition cabinets on the continent which, in contrast to the Anglo-American world, are the rule and not the exception. Democracy and old liberalism have something else in common. They share the optimistic Russellian view of man. Man is basically good and wise, let him act according to his whims, his desires, his intuitions, and everything will be all right. The good people will prevail, almost automatically. In this attitude democracy is far from Calvin, and the argument that it really has its historic roots in Calvinist synods, the Synod of Dordrecht has been named as a conspicuous example, becomes somewhat questionable. Of course the term good implies a value judgment. The true agnostic would be rather inclined to say, man is as he is, you prefer him to act this way and I that way, and that is where we are. Such would be the position of the grandfather of democracy, the Marquis de Sade. Still, whatever the formulation, democracy and old liberalism give a basically unqualified yes to man, though not to each individual man. In this respect, needless to say, old liberalism shows that it has its roots in preliberalism rather than in early liberalism. The fear of interference is very highly developed in the first and third stage of genuine liberalism. Here again the deist and subtly pantheistic attitude of the Manchester School and Adam Smith comes to the fore. Democracy as an ideology maintains that if one voted after mature reflection and in an unfettered way, the relatively best decision could be made and progress thereby assured. A million eyes see better than a single pair. This, however, as we all know, is certainly not borne out by the facts. Such belief is a fetish of the democratist, a magic formula which, as history teaches, sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. For reasons we shall give elsewhere, it will work less and less as time goes on, last but not least because the information explosion has brought us confusion and bewilderment rather than enlightenment and balance. To know facts still does not mean to know how to weigh evidence. The democratic optimism as to man, his nature, and the entire universe also animated the old liberals who, to be sure, unlike certain Democrats, always insisted that man needs first to be educated. We guardedly said certain Democrats because there are many people who seem enchanted if elections are held in African jungles where the illiterates are gently guided by the choice of animal symbols. Knowledge and maturity are undemocratic principles. The vast majority of Democrats, however, still believe that literacy is a prerequisite for the vote, the new American Voting Rights Bill notwithstanding. And that a free press and witty radio commentators can do the trick. This emphasis on education in an intellectual and a moral sense has definitely an elitarian character. Just like the preliberals, the old liberals thought that the sum total of all enlightened self-interests would, in a mysterious harmony, automatically make for happiness and a life of plenty, that especially in the field of economics this would lead to abundance and the survival of the fittest. These in turn, by their pull and their shining example would raise general levels. Half-truths, one can say, are optimistic exaggerations. Still, the old liberal stand caused infinitely fewer tragedies than the opposite errors of the leftist Gnostics, in the sense Erik von Kuehnelt-Leddihn uses this term, and of the red monasticists whom we have mentioned earlier. As one can easily see, there is a certain psychological connection between the social Darwinism adopted by the old liberals, strongly rejected by most of the early liberals, and democratic optimism believing not exactly in the survival of the fittest, but in the identity of wisdom and majority opinion. There is a precursor to this in the Christian adage securus iudicat orbis terrarum, the judgment of the big wide world is infallible. It should not be surprising that this old liberal social Darwinism not only had a Manchesterian root but also played into the hands of the Nazis at a later period. In the whole Manchesterian calculation, however, there always lurked the danger of mammothism and colossalism, of cartels, trust, and monopolies which are an evil not so much because they are big and dwarf the individual, but because they are menacing the most important aspect of a free economy, i.e., competition. Without a free choice for the customer to buy this or that product and without the competition between enterprises trying to produce the best and the cheapest, there is no free economy. True, the evils engendered by a private monopoly are sometimes as great as those due to the state monopoly of socialism. We say sometimes because the monolithic aspect of state-controlled economic production, as well as the repetitious rewards for party loyalty which are crucial in the managerial appointments inevitably lead to corruption and inefficiency, and these indeed are the far greater evils. Thus the private enterprise monopolies, though lacking the proper incentives of competition, will still give better service, will be better administered, will make greater efforts than their state-owned counterparts. There is an example of this in the United States where the Bell telephone system is a virtual monopoly but still vastly superior to the United States Post Office with its strongly political character, the job of postmaster being one of the typical plums in the spoil system. Old liberalism in Europe also had the tendency to enter into various alliances and combinations. On the one hand it preached an extreme liberalism in the economic field, but on the other it merged with nationalism which, in Europe, has an ethnic connotation. Bismarck derived his main support from the national liberals and not from the Prussian conservatives who were Prussian patriots and not nationalists with pan-German leanings. Ethnic nationalism was always anti-Catholic, anti-papal, with the exception of Irish and Polish nationalism, and above all this animosity played into the hands of the old liberals. Since they hated anything they called dogmatism, they were, as we have hinted before, opposed to religious orthodoxy and above all to Rome. Bismarck's Kulturkampf pleased nationalists, old liberals, and national liberals almost equally. It won no applause from the Prussian conservatives although they were staunch Lutherans. Obviously the aristocratic character of early liberalism was not inherited by the old liberals who got their main support from the upper and middle bourgeoisie, precisely the layers of society which had anti-clerical and nationalistic leanings. In some countries, we think here above all of the Latin nations, old liberalism allied itself strongly with Freemasonry, which in these countries has a character quite at variance with its counterpart in the English-speaking world. There was and there remains a real antagonism between the Grand Orient of Paris with all its affiliates and the two main British rights. Given all these alliances and connections, it is not surprising that old liberalism became a liberal. If one is solemnly convinced that all strong stands, all firm affirmations, all orthodoxy, all absolutes in thought are evil, then indeed one becomes inclined to show hostility to all representatives of absolutism, religious, political, philosophical, or otherwise, and, if one had the chance, to persecute them methodically and mercilessly. Since the old liberals in the second half of the 19th century and also frequently in the early 20th century had, thanks to the property qualifications for voting, great parliamentary power, they could also abuse it. Owing to their intellectual appeal they had a near monopoly in the universities and acquired an iron grip on the press, the theater, and the entire intellectual life. Thus they could painfully discriminate against their conservative and Christian opponents. The Holy American Illiberal Inquisition, as we see, had a forerunner. The old liberals, moreover, had some supporters in the working class, even in the aristocracy and quite frequently in the royal families. They were, in fact, only rarely anti-monarchists. They were favorable to democracy, as we have pointed out before, but they did not underwrite it without reservations and usually considered it as just one useful element in a mixed government. The Spanish aristocracy was largely liberal. So was a sizable part of the Italian, the Portuguese, the Bavarian, the Hungarian, and the Scottish nobility. Franz Joseph's sympathies lay with the liberals and so, notoriously, did his sons, the ill-fated Crown Prince Rudolph. His brother the tragic Maximilian of Mexico, contrary to what the average American or European tends to believe, was even an ardent liberal. The royal houses of Italy, Spain, and Portugal were largely liberal. Privileges were not decried by the old liberals provided these were held by the right people. Whatever might be said against the old liberals, and a great deal can be, they were never really a party of the left. Actually, the old liberals were responsible for their own decline around the end of the century. In Austria, the introduction of the one-man, one-vote principle in 1907 was a great blow to them. Their anti-clericalism led to a rather well-organized Catholic opposition which astounded and dismayed the old liberal leadership. It is obvious that the Church did not at all like the idea of descending into the political arena and competing with other secular ideologies. It was the, unofficially Catholic, Center Party which defeated Bismarck and made him eat humble pie. These Catholic parties, after all, had the allegiance of a good cross-section of the people, peasants, craftsmen, shopkeepers, professional men, intellectuals, and the nobility. The evangelicals could not found a similar party because they were already doctrinally too much allied with old liberalism and/or nationalism, all the troubles the old liberals had caused in marriage and school legislation, all the laws they had enacted which were alien to the spirit of the Church, compulsory civil marriage, as an example, now boomeranged against them. A boomerang, however, also came from the other side. The rise of the socialist parties which had partly benefited from the anti-clerical attitude spread rather unwisely by the old liberals. Neither the New Catholic nor the Socialist opposition against Old Liberalism was characterized by an appeal to liberty. As a matter of fact, Old Liberalism had contributed by its ambiguous attitudes to rendering even the word liberty suspect. In France, liberty meant expelling religious orders. In Hungary, it was used to justify compulsory civil marriage. In Spain, it worked as a screen for the confiscation of almost all church property. In Switzerland and in Germany, it was invoked to exile the Jesuits. By the outbreak of World War I, Old Liberalism found itself in a very grave crisis. It remained entrenched in certain intellectual strongholds, but it was totally beaten in the field of power politics. The liberal parties on the continent had been decimated. What remained were specific positions in the universities and a still sizable liberal press, which had become a middle-of-the-road institution promising, not always truthfully, objectivity to its readers. In the practical political sphere, however, it no longer could deliver the goods. This startling phenomenon could be observed all over Europe. Papers such as the Frankfurter Zeitung, the Corriere della Sera, Le Temps, Die Neue Freie Presse, or De Algemeen Handelsblad still held their leading position, but they ceased to affect elections. Deeply allied with nationalism, the Old Liberals could not take an independent line in World War I either. Among the allies, they were tied to the war interest, felt that they had a real stake in it, and naively hoped that the murderous struggle would foster their cause. Among the Central Powers, Old Liberalism was haunted by the thought that its followers were better entrenched in the Allied camp. And when it came to the Paris Peace Conference, Western Old Liberals were among the most fanatic supporters of a hard peace, thus contributing to the rise of National Socialism in Germany, while in Central Europe they tended to blame their old governments for the beginning and the end of the war and thereby invited the wrath of the totalitarian nationalists, who denounced them as traitorous collaborators with the West. Whatever they did wrong, which is not so surprising in the light of the fact that they had completely parted with absolutes and played politics by ear. History does not honor mere goodwill or good intentions. When the totalitarian wave started, the Old Liberals were persecuted, in a sense, more bitterly than the people on the left. Those on the left, Socialists, Communists, and Jacobin Democrats, were totalitarian competitors, not mutual enemies. The Social Democratic worker in Essen and the Socialist worker in Sesto San Giovanni or in Turin could very easily switch sides. The worker in Essen gave up international socialism and embraced National Socialism. The directors of his factory were now mere stewards of the state. The worker in Turin knew that Benito Mussolini had been a socialist and that the fascist movement had grown out of Italian socialism, shedding first of all its international outlook. This is just what the Czech National Socialists had done when they seceded from the Czech Social Democratic Party in 1897. The Old Liberals had nothing but declared enemies and no competitors. They could not easily switch. The new, big totalitarian parties stemming from the French Revolution boasted of being democratic. They called themselves socialist. They too were engaged in the perennial trick of successful leftist parties ever since 1789, the mobilization of envy. The Old Liberals, whatever their faults, and they had many, abstained from this tempting strategy which proved so rewarding at the polls. Professor Edward Hyman, a German religious socialist, wrote very correctly during World War II. Hitlerism proclaims itself as both true democracy and true socialism, and the terrible truth is that there is a grain of truth to such claims, an infinitesimal grain, to be sure, but at any rate enough to serve as a basis for such fantastic distortions. Hitlerism even goes so far as to claim the role of protector of Christianity, and the terrible truth is that even this gross misinterpretation is able to make some impression. But one fact stands out with perfect clarity in all the fog: Hitler has never claimed to represent true liberalism. Liberalism then has the distinction of being the doctrine most hated by Hitler. We, however, would go a great deal further than this author who by conviction was a Democrat and a socialist. Still, his thesis is correct, even in the light of the curious fact that national liberalism, this particular Central European compound, had and even today still has subtle links with Nazism. Since the death of the so oratorically gifted German Social Democrat leader Kurt Schumacher, a real nationalist, the Nazi Old Guard rather sympathizes with the Free Democratic Party, FDP, aptly called by the foreign press the Liberal Party. Exactly the same situation exists in Austria, where the Freiheitliche Partei Österreichs, FPO, Liberal Party of Austria, is the joint party of surviving old liberals and of ex-Nazis. And it is not so much the national liberal past, but rather anti-clericalism which brought both camps together. It was also, needless to say, not the enthusiasm for liberty but the hostility towards organized religion in general and Christian orthodoxy in particular that caused the old liberalism to be energetically attacked by the Catholic Church. Pope Pius IX in Proposition 80 of his Syllabus Aurum, December 8, 1864, condemned the following statement: the Roman Pontiff can and should reconcile himself and cooperate with progress, liberalism and modern civil society. This anti-liberal trauma remained for a long time a very potent force in Orthodox Christianity, not only in the Catholic Church, and when neoliberalism developed in the 1930s and 1940s, it was often difficult to persuade freedom-loving Christian thinkers that this new phase of liberalism differed in many important and even decisive ways from its immediate predecessor, because the word liberal created a mental block among many devout Christians. The term neoliberalism, denoting the fourth phase of liberalism, hardly appears before the end of World War II. When in 1946 a remnant of liberal scholars met at the Mont Pelerin Hotel near the northern shores of Lake Geneva to coordinate their forces and form an organization, it soon became apparent that a certain fission had taken place in and outside the domain of economics. There were now, mostly in Central Europe, thinkers who viewed the problem of liberty in a different light than the men who belonged to a somewhat older generation and in many ways could have been called their teachers. Almost all of them, to be sure, as far as economics go, had been inspired by Ludwig von Mises, but in matters of economics these newer lights were less radical in their outlook, and they admitted curbs on mammotherism and colossalism to preserve competition. They thought that the state had a right and even a duty to correct possible abuses of economic freedom, just as we give to a mature person a driving license and the right to travel wherever he wants but still make him submit to traffic laws. Yet probably more important than this change was the reappraisal of religion, especially of Christianity. Many of the neoliberals declared that it is not sufficient to prove that liberty delivers the goods, that freedom is more agreeable or more productive than slavery. There must be philosophical and even theological reasons why liberty must be achieved, fostered, preserved. One of the neoliberals, perhaps the one best known in the United States, the late Professor Wilhelm Röpke, maintained that even if it could be proved to him that a planned and collective economy is materially superior to a free one, he would still, in an ascetic spirit, prefer the latter. Under these circumstances, sacrifices of a material order would have to be made to preserve the dignity of man. From such views we can deduct that the neoliberals had, in a certain way, a greater affinity with the early liberals than with their immediate predecessors. Interested in economic problems, they refused, however, to make a fetish of economics, and they tried to integrate their economic views into a metaphysical humanism. The great early liberal thinkers, from de Tocqueville to Burckhardt, were seriously studied by new liberals who in many cases were professing Christians. The new liberalism started in the German-speaking countries. This is not an accident because in this area the old liberalism had suffered its major bankruptcy and had helped to undermine the older Christian civilization, a process from which the totalitarians derive the greatest profit. Who are the leading neoliberals? Three of the founders of the new liberalism have died: Walter Eucken, professor of economics at Freiburg University in Breisgau, Alexander Rusto, professor emeritus of Heidelberg University, and Wilhelm Röpke, professor at the École des Hautes Études in Geneva. Alexander Rusto was the son of a Prussian general who, out of juvenile enthusiasm, joined the Spartacist movement in 1919. Penniless and near despair, he was aided by that famous Catholic priest and charity organizer, Dr. Karl Sonnenschein, who provided him with a desk and a typewriter. Rusto, never adhering formally to a church, and always cultivating a somewhat anarchical outlook, became first deeply interested in Greek philosophy, especially in the pre-Socratics, and only later in his life concentrated on economic problems within their historical, sociological, and theological context. When Nazism made research impossible and academic liberties illusory, Rusto emigrated to Turkey in order to remain near to his country. He taught for many years at the University of Istanbul. Alexander Rusto is famous not only for his essay on Manchesterism but mainly for his stupendous 3-volume Ortsbestimmung der Gegenwart. Like all other neoliberals, Rusto, who died in 1964, always refused to deal with economics in an isolated way, detached from all the other disciplines. His book, whose title in English, literally translated, means Location of the Present, offers us a sweeping historical view of one of our last polyhistors, a work in some ways more impressive than Toynbee's A Study of History. Today, however, the use of any language other than English is a grave handicap to worldwide fame. Jacob Burckhardt, Orby at 1897, for instance, was unknown in the English-speaking world until the middle of World War II, and even Max Weber gained only posthumous recognition in America. Very little, indeed, is known in the United States or even in Britain about the conservative authors of the continent. The late Walter Eucken, professor of economics, and Franz Bohm, professor of law at Jena University, were both active in the German resistance. Eucken was jailed for some time. After the war they founded Ordo, a liberal, predominantly neoliberal, yearbook containing essays of a very high quality. Professor Wilhelm Röpke also fled first to Turkey but finally went to Switzerland, where he taught until his untimely death in Geneva in 1966. During the last years of the war he published his first stirring books. These dealt either with basic economic problems or with political, social, and cultural questions in which he equally espoused the cause of liberty. At the end of the war he wrote a memorandum for the Allies recommending a monarchic restoration in Germany, a step advocated by Chancellor Brüning as early as 1932. In Brüning's case it was the aging Hindenburg, in Röpke's case it was the Allies who ignored these suggestions. As a matter of fact, the Soviets vied with the United States in imposing, fostering, and promoting the republican form of government. Moved by her self-interest, they were seeking a parliamentary frame for communist parties to cooperate with legally in a constitutional form, eventually to kill the Constitution. Professor Getzbriefs, another eminent star in the galaxy of neoliberal thinkers, has been living in the United States ever since the earliest days of Nazism and was for a long time professor at Georgetown University. Originally he came from the school loosely identified as Catholic social thought, the tradition emanating from Kettler and Vogelsang. He started as professor at the Technische Hochschule in Berlin-Charlottenburg and is a prolific writer. In recent years he has occupied himself with the problem of trade unions acting as a state within a state and developing here and there into a real menace to a free society, and even to democracy. The neoliberals are hardly organized, and it is significant that in the Germanies they have no special love for those parties which do not quite wear the liberal label but are usually referred to as liberal. Many of the neoliberals are contributors to Ordo, published annually in Düsseldorf. Naturally they collaborate with the Institut für freie Marktwirtschaft in Heidelberg-Bonn, an organization engaged in economic research and in propaganda for the free market economy, i.e., free enterprise. In 1962 they held a memorable private roundtable conference in Augsburg with Catholic sociologists, but the demarcation lines were blurred inasmuch as some of the attending neoliberals were professing Catholics. It became evident that the viewpoints expressed on this occasion were indeed not far from each other. N.B. Obviously, a man such as Cobden might also figure as a late proliberal, Edmund Burke as an early conservative. We have omitted American names deliberately. In a few cases it is not easy to draw the dividing line between neoliberals and certain later old liberals. Professor Friedrich August von Hayek, for instance, is a thinker on the borderline, but rather old than new. While Wilhelm Röpke could be called a conservative, FAV. Hayek declines this label. Alexander Rusto was in many ways a conservative. Recapitulating the four phases of genuine liberalism, it might be helpful to make a tabulation which, permitting for certain simplifications, would roughly look like the table on page 200. Realizing, however, that European new liberals and modern conservatives often have become practically indistinguishable from each other, we cannot help remembering how different the situation is in the United States, not in fact but purely from the point of view of current labels. Indeed, we have before us two problems to be solved. First, to find out how it happened that liberalism in the United States evolved into the very opposite of what it set out to be, if it did evolve. Thereby morally forfeiting the right to call itself liberal, and second, later on, to analyze what conservatism, old and new, really stands for or, at least, ought to stand for. Chapter 14. False Liberalism. Toward the end of World War II the American Mercury, then under the editorship of Eugene Lyons, featured a series of articles in which a variety of authors defended their political social stand. This writer's interest focused on an essay by Oswald Garrison Villar, entitled Credo of an Old-Fashioned Liberal. The article made it evident that Villar's stand showed strong analogies with the gentlemanly and Erasmian version of continental Old Liberalism, a liberalism, one might add, not so different from the liberalism once prevailing in England and in the United States during most of the 19th century. We do not thereby imply that there were no differences on that score on both sides of the channel. In England, too, where, in a way, the Whigs had been replaced by the Liberals, the latter were increasingly exposed to leftist influences. In the 19th century it seemed for a time that the Conservatives, Tories, had a chance to become the party of social reform, especially so under Disraeli and under the influence of Lord Randolph Churchill. This is by no means surprising if we recall that continental conservatism and certain forms of paternalism went well together, as illustrated by the patriarchal character of large land ownership. In Sweden, in the past, socialists and conservatives often have voted together against the liberals, the party of big business and industry, yet by the end of the 19th century in Britain the competition of the Labour Party made itself felt and some of the liberals drifted toward the left. Fabian influence was by no means innocent in this evolution. A Gladstone, a Rosebery, an Asquith, needless to say, were anything but leftists, but another factor also played a certain role: the split over Irish Home Rule, which was instrumental in facilitating the switching of sides of those liberals who had nationalist leanings. Under the leadership of David Lloyd George, the Liberal Party moved to left of center. Their social program was strongly radicalized, and this change had been promoted, fostered, and abetted by an ambitious young man who had deserted the Conservative Party to become an ardent liberal, the son of Lord Randolph Churchill, Mr. Winston Spencer Churchill, whose elevation to the rank of a great conservative is one of the most amusing misunderstandings in our time. As a not-so-young radical, he campaigned for Lloyd George's war budget against poverty, which was designed to make indigents as rare as the wolves who once infected England's forests. The Great Society, Act 1. As could be suspected, the Labour Party finally reduced the Liberals to such a size that they became impotent in British politics and retained only some local influence in Wales. All they can do now is tip the scales in Parliament, provided a near equality in the number of Conservative and Labour MPs makes this possible. Nor does British party liberalism have any longer a real program, neither politically nor economically. The evolution of the term liberal in the United States, an evolution which took place only in the last 30 years, shows certain minor analogies with the change in Britain but has few equivalents on the continent. This is so because there the sectarian liberal, as Carlton J. H. Hayes defined him, might have been prejudiced, inflexible, and petty, especially in his anti-clericalism, but he had no leftist bent and, apart from his nationalistic proclivities, no identitarian mentality. How then did this change really take place? How was it possible that in the United States the word that means freedom-loving, generous, tolerant, open-minded, hostile to state omnipotence and anti-totalitarian, came to stand for the very contrary of all these notions and virtues? This process is easily explained. The old-fashioned liberal was often the man who refused to resist what might be called the wave of the future. The conservative, and even more so the reactionary, usually decided to make a stand against change, and change was largely a leftward movement. The leftist ideologies had all assumed, inevitably so, one might say, a futuristic character, a term we also find in the history of art, and it is not accidental that its major spokesman, Marinetti, became an ardent fascist. The leftist ideologies all claimed the future, they claimed utopia, they claimed the millennium in a chiliastic spirit. They believed in the concept of a near-automatic progress, which needed just a little push. The road in this fictional direction had in their eyes the character of an advance, whereas conservatives merely adhered to the status quo and the reactionaries to a backward trend. The situation in this respect was not radically different on the continent. It is certainly with a sense of irony that the Guide Bleu, Paris, Hachette, edited by Professor Marcel N. Schweitzer of the Sorbonne, said in its 1935 edition, "Malaga is a city of very advanced ideas." On May 12 and 13, 1931, no less than 43 churches and convents were burnt down, p. 562. The monarchy had fallen and the short-lived, infamous republic was moving ahead. It is obvious that an unimaginative martinet such as General Franco wanted to stop this kind of advance. There were old-fashioned, i.e., genuine liberals who clung to their convictions. Albert J. Nock, even H. L. Mencken were among them. But many others dreaded being called conservatives or reactionaries. As long as there existed a utopia at the end of the road, painted in the colors of absolute personal freedom, the genuine liberal was sure to be a progressive. Before the 1930s, the ultra-radical, the extremist, especially in America, was not the socialist, not the communist, but the anarchist. As a matter of fact, it took Americans quite some time to distinguish between the communist and the anarchist, and to the average American for a long time the Bolshevik was an unshaven, rowdyish creature who wanted no law, no order, but the eternal overthrow of everything, in other words, an anarchist. The more spectacular acts of violence were all carried out by anarchists, whereas communists, believing in mass action at the right time, in military conquest and in civil wars, abhor individual action. Even in Russia the communists, or, to be even more exact, the radical wing of the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party, had never carried out assassinations or acts of terror, and the very first communists, Bolsheviki, who had suffered death for cause were those executed in the Civil War. Russian communism up to 1918 had no martyrs. When I arrived in the United States for the first time in 1937, I had to give written assurance that I was neither a bigamist nor an anarchist. Violent, rampaging lawless freedom still seemed to be the menace. It was also the direction in which the world, to the less initiated at least, gradually seemed to be moving. Respect and authority were declining, divorce was becoming easier and more common, crowned heads were toppling, censorship was disappearing right and left, travel was becoming simpler, liberal parties were still scoring in elections in parts of the Western world. Thus the genuine American liberal could be fully convinced that with his political convictions the future belonged to him. It was only because of the leniency and the tolerance of Americans and British liberals of an age gone by toward the real leftists, that liberals became suspect. The great change, however, came only in the 1930s when certain Americans, who saw in their country primarily not their fatherland but the American experiment, suddenly thought that the Soviet experiment offered even more to mankind. This was the Red Decade, to quote the title of a book by Eugene Lyons. In other words, the vision of tomorrow now took another form. Liberty no longer was the ideal. Security and equality, the promises of international socialism, rather than individual freedom now were the new goals. Mrs. Anne Morrow Lindbergh, in her book The Wave of the Future, pleaded for a more realistic understanding of National Socialism. Yet the disease of democratic utopianism and a certain materialism had already too deeply affected the American liberals for them to overcome the fear of clinging to a lost cause. They were too afraid to miss the bus, and the horror of getting stuck with the ideas of yesterday troubled them profoundly. They had no consistent system of ideas, no principles, no real leadership. They were drifting, and drifts are determined by winds and currents. These now carried them toward determinism and collectivism, toward a secular monasticism, and thus toward what can be called the opposite direction from their initial stand, into rank illiberality. At the same time they preserved a few hardly essential notions from their past and, as could be expected, flatly refused to give up their label. In the end we got the great American semantic confusion, and it lives on to this very day. The old liberal ideas on matters such as sexual morals, prison administration, capital punishment, and the emancipation of women largely survive, but it is in their basic outlook on the state and society that the old liberals in the United States, far more so than in Britain, have made an about-face of 180 degrees. Liberals in all ages have looked at the state, always prone to annexations, with a great deal of suspicion. This tendency of the state is especially marked in the democratic order, not only because democracy is inherently totalitarian but also because it works, to use John Adams' term, with largesses, large-scale bribes, promises rashly and shrewdly made by the demagogoi. It matters little that the encroachments of the state tend in a subtle way to undermine democracy. Bureaucracy quickly assumes oligarchic and autocratic traits. Yet expansion, encroachment on personal rights, remains inseparable from democracy. The old liberal did not necessarily like the democratic notion of the politicized citizenry. As a matter of fact, he often suspected it of being fundamentally illiberal. However, his resistance against the new winds and currents was not only weak because he cherished so deeply the idea of belonging to the camp of the innovators, progressivists, and Daunists, an expression of Michael de la Baudelaire, hailing the new and damning the obsolete, but because he had previously been robbed of his sense of values. He had lost his philosophical props at a much earlier date. These had been eliminated half a generation before by philosophies such as instrumentalism and behaviorism, as well as by polite doubt, actually a refined form of positivism. This view has been represented so well in the American scene by Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., grandson of a Calvinist clergyman, son of a theologically liberal physician and essayist, himself a justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, and a complete nihilist. Whereas pragmatism came on the American educational scene through that notorious institution of pedagogical training of which it has been said that their false pearls were thrown to real swine, the justice influenced legal thinking, which in the United States is equally important to education. As a real positivist, Holmes could write that sovereignty is a form of power, and the will of the sovereign is law because he has power to compel obedience or punish disobedience and for no other reason. The limits within which his will is law, then, are those within which he has, or is believed to have power to compel or to punish. If these were his true convictions, there was certainly no reason why he should have condemned the horrors of the French Revolution, of Sachsenhausen, or of the conciliatory of Stalin. Or was this only a lapsus linguae? Holmes could hardly have been more explicit when he wrote, "I think that the sacredness of human life is a purely municipal idea of no validity outside the jurisdiction. I believe that force, mitigated so far as may be by good manners, is the ultima ratio, and between two groups that want to make inconsistent kinds of a world I see no remedy except force." What a pity, a Nazi might say, that Holmes was not one of the judges at Nuremberg. He died in 1935, the Nazis also could have made monkeys out of the Allies simply by quoting him. And if the reader is not convinced by these passages, let us add another: I see no reason for attributing to man a significance different in kind from that which belongs to a baboon or a grain of sand. I believe that our personality is a cosmic ganglion, just as when certain rays meet and cross there is a white light at the meeting point, but the rays go on after the meeting as they did before, so when certain other streams of energy cross at the meeting point, the cosmic ganglion can frame a syllogism or wag its tail. There we have it, a grain of sand, baboon, Jew, bourgeoisie, let's rub them out. Does it make us much happier to learn that the late Justice Holmes had a most humble opinion about himself? His pessimistic nihilism surely extended to his own person, as we feel when we read, "I may work a year or two, but I cannot hope to add much to what I have done. I am too skeptical to think that it matters much, but too conscious of the mystery of the universe to say that it or anything else does not. I bow my head, I think serenely and say, as I told to someone the other day, O Cosmos, now lettest thou thy ganglion dissolve in peace." This admission is not less dangerous because it is melancholic in spirit. It has, however, helped to establish a pattern which still is going strong. Witness the opinion given by Justice Vincent in 1951 in connection with a trial of communists. Nothing is more certain in modern society than the principle that there are no absolutes, that a name, a phrase, a standard has meaning only when associated with the considerations which give birth to nomenclature. To those who would paralyze our government in the face of impending threat by encasing it in a semantic straitjacket, we must reply that all concepts are relative. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. would have subscribed to this formulation half a century earlier. He once said that Emperor Franz Joseph was a gentleman, but that the monarch was a perfect illustration of my old saying that no gentleman can be a philosopher and no philosopher a gentleman. To the philosopher everything is fluid, even himself. This means, in other words, that there is a real antithesis between philosophy and permanence, that there can be no immutable truths. The consequences of such an attitude, clearly catastrophic, have shocked a number of European philosophers, though others expressed analogous ideas. An Austrian legal thinker of considerable influence on both sides of the Atlantic, Hans Kelsen, drafter of the still valid Republican Constitution of Austria, has said that justice is an irrational ideal. However indispensable it might be for man's will and action, it cannot be reached by knowledge. The real danger of this nihilism lies in the fact that its disciples find no reason to resist evil and are intellectually defenseless in the face of such diabolical menaces as national or international socialism. Kelsen was once asked by Wilhelm Röpke what cogent argument he had against the Nazi extermination camps, whereupon he just smiled and shrugged his shoulders, even though, had he stayed on in Austria, he would have been one of their victims. The lack of well-grounded convictions, the absence of a belief in truth create a dangerous hunger. And since nature abhors a vacuum, the absolutes of the totalitarian system suddenly find customers. The isms then appear on the scene and, as Fyodor Stepan said, give to the hungry demo-liberal nihilistic world the truth, but this truth in reality is a lie and a travesty of religion. Of course, as Kaiserling has observed, there also exists a real absolutism of the relativists, who remind one of Hayes's sectarian liberals, but they fail in the emergency. They can be petty, stupid, and stubborn, but they cannot make a stand for the true good, even if such stand is in favor of the positive values inherent in the great religions of the West. This nihilism goes very well with the naturalism represented by Edward Lee Thorndike, who had a great influence at Teachers College, Columbia University. Dr. S.J. Holmes has well summed up the philosophy of Professor Thorndike in the following words: man's traits, insofar as they are a part of his inheritance, owe their origin and biological meaning to their survival value. All natural traits and impulses of human beings must therefore be fundamentally good, if we consider the good as the biologically useful. Cruelty, selfishness, lust, cowardice, and deceit are normal ingredients of human nature which have their useful role in the struggle for existence. Intrinsically they are all virtues. It is only their excess or their exercise under the wrong conditions that justly incur our moral disapproval. Was Professor Thorndike an isolated case of the lonely thinker or a real former of minds on a large scale? Dean Seashore of the University of Iowa said of him, "No school is uninfluenced and no humanistic science is unaffected by his labor." Dean James E. Russell insisted that, in developing the subject of educational psychology and in making it fit study for students in all departments, Professor Thorndike has shaped the character of the college in its youth as no one else has done and as no one will ever have the opportunity of doing. There are interesting parallels between the nihilistic and materialistic undermining of the old-fashioned American liberal faith with relativist ideas and the erosion of the faith of the French upper layers prior to the Revolution through Voltairean skepticism, followed by the fanatical, yet in a way consistent philosophy of Rousseau. The nihilism inherent in the instrumentalism and pragmatism of John Dewey's philosophy also provided Marxism with an opening wedge. If all spiritual values, if revelation, if the concept of the natural law, if the Aristotelian tradition were illusory and Christian existentialism from St. Augustine to Kierkegaard were unscientific, then a naked materialism within and outside existentialism might well be the answer. As we have seen, Sade had established this bridge between a subjectivist relativism and rank materialism. In other words, not only the drifting of lost old liberals, but also a corrosive agnosticism helped to transfigure this set of ideas into the very opposite of what they first were. This is not the first time history has seen such a metamorphosis. One has only to remember the ideas and ideals the reformers stood for, then look at the form and content of religious thought offered to students in the average Protestant theological seminary in the United States. Here we are obviously not talking about the admirable fundamentalist or orthodox institutes of theological learning, which are in a minority and often sadly lack prestige. The outstanding theological seminaries of the Reformation faiths are normally victims of the grandchild of Catholic scholasticism, that is to say rationalism, and of the grandchild of Catholic Renaissance, the Enlightenment. To make matters worse, there is the lamentable tendency to project modern, popular notions about Protestantism back to the Reformers. Not only would it have been interesting to see Luther's reaction if anybody had called him a Protestant, a term of contempt coined by the budding Counter-Reformation, he would also have been amazed at being accused of advocating private interpretation, an early liberalism, the abolition of auricular confession, or of the Latin language in the ritual, humanitarianism, individualism, racial equality, democracy, etc. The Reformation was a rigoristic, conservative movement, a reaction against humanism, against the Renaissance, which eventually became totally transformed by highly secular tendencies emanating, to be true, from cultural trends in the Orbis Catholicus. In other words, if we exclude fundamentalism and orthodoxy, or neo-orthodoxy, Protestantism became its very opposite. And we cite this religious analogy because the same can be said of American liberalism, though even here we have glaring exceptions. Professor Milton Friedman, for instance, who teaches at the University of Chicago and acted as advisor to Senator Goldwater during the latter's presidential campaign, still calls himself proudly a liberal. And so do others. Since American freelancing leftism, parading under the stolen liberal label, is the result of an inversion of its former self, it does not present us with a truly systematic and coherent logical picture. It suffers from inconsistencies and contradictions. No wonder, since it is a halfway house, after all. Thus the American leftist or left of centrist, while talking basically the identitarian jargon of leftism, will suddenly inject into his talk ideas belonging to the liberal past. Not being a systematic thinker, but a person subconsciously torn between parts of American folklore, 19th century reactions to Calvinism and radical leftism, he is not really aware of his dilemma. And not being aware of his dilemma, he is prone to the worst miscalculations in dealing with truly systematic thought abroad. Hence his naive belief that, to quote only one instance, Russian Marxism could be liberalized to the extent that Western capitalism, treated with socialist hormones, could finally meet it halfway. The meeting, naturally, can be effected, but only in such a way that the flexible is bent like a blade against a concrete wall until it touches the rigid.
We can be gradually socialized, communized and Sovietized, industries can be nationalized, but it is difficult to see how Russian industry or agriculture could ever be transformed into private property without a. the collapse of the secular religion of communism, and b. a transitional period of total chaos and anarchy.
Revolution always remains a possibility, though in a totalitarian state a fairly remote one, but from an evolutionary viewpoint socialism is always a dead-end street. Yugoslavia now experiences this difficulty. If you have the two long legs of free enterprise you can run, with the short legs of socialism you barely walk, but with one long and one short leg you fall on your nose. We must also beware of believing that ideologies can be dealt with in the abstract, i.e., without any reference to national psychological situations. British and American thought looks with disfavor upon systems, airtight explanations of history, religion, psychology, economics, etc. It does not like extremes. It has a horror of going down to roots, radicalism, or of embracing the absolute. Thus it is not merely the transitional aspect of American left of centrism that gives it its confused character, but also the Anglo-Saxon isolation made worse by a dislike for system, method, and logical rigidity. Witness Oliver Wendell Holmes's insistence that no gentleman can be a philosopher. If one peruses the 39 articles of the liberal creed as presented in James Burnham's brilliant Suicide of the West, one is immediately aware of the frequency of contradictions and of the highly eclectic character of the tenets. Point 9, for instance, saying that governments have the right to expropriate, though not without reasonable compensation, its own nationals or foreigners, is clearly a leftist proposition. But to say, as point 17 insists, that communists have a right to express their opinion, is a liberal, not necessarily a leftist view. Yet when it is deprived of its corollary, i.e., that fascists and Nazis ought to have the same right, it is a parti pris for a specific type of leftism against another one and thus becomes a liberal. Point 38. declaring that everyone has the right to form and join trade unions, is liberal rather than leftist, but if the formulation were to the effect that everybody gainfully employed should be forced to join a union or a specific union, then we would be face to face with a genuinely leftist, anti-personal and coercive demand stemming from a social totalitarianism that might even be endorsed by the state. Of course, the closed shop and the union shop are rather democratic, no escape from conformity and horizontal pressures. Point 19, stating that corporal punishment, except possibly for small children, is wrong, is also liberal and not leftist. The pros and cons of such an issue have a great deal to do with ethnic cultural patterns. Corporal punishment has a stronger tradition in Northern and Eastern than in Central or Southern Europe. Point 8 is interesting because it states that progressive income and inheritance taxes are the fairest form of taxation. Is this liberal or leftist? Here the answer is not easy. It is not only part of American, but also of Western folklore that the rich ought to be soaked. As long as the majorities endorse this practice, and they do, it must be considered democratic, even though it is contrary to the democratic principle of equality, because if the rich man pays 50 cents and his less affluent fellow citizen only 25 cents of his dollar in taxes, equality before the law becomes a sham. Yet, whatever our exegesis of Mr. Burnham's test, it is obvious that American leftism, which no longer deserves the name of liberalism, has a transitory character, but the transition takes place progressively from rightist to leftist positions. This evolution, moreover, is not only in harmony with the likings and leanings of the semi-intellectuals who provide American moderate leftism with leadership, but is also largely consonant with the instincts and aspirations of the masses, of the American masses as well as of the masses anywhere else. There exists, primarily in America, a myth to the effect that the masses are noble, good, decent, honest, and that they are merely misled by diabolical eggheads of the leftist persuasion, by a tiny minority with key positions in education, publishing, the press, the theatrical world, and the movie industry. This, however, is a gross and dangerous oversimplification. There might be certain sound instincts in the multitudes, but since they consist of human beings and not angels, they are also subject to animal instincts and to specifically human frailties, envy, jealousy, egotism, greed, avarice, pettiness. Their sense of justice is not always strong, their sadistic drives can be well developed, their sense of fairness impaired, their knowledge limited, their historic memory bad, and so forth. Thus the question remains whether the American moderate leftists have injected new and evil ideas into the American scene or whether they have not rather exploited negative drives, have appealed to the seamier side of human nature and, above all, have achieved whatever popularity they have by merely formulating cleverly and coherently the ideas and notions which could be found inchoately before their rise to eminence, before they took over the intellectual leadership of the nation. In spite of the fact that American leftists were quite adroit in importing ideas from Europe and have acted consistently as agents of European ideologies, propagating them either in toto or in selected fragments in a new synthesis, they were never insensitive to local American notions. Take merely the curious expression Americanism. Communist propaganda in the late 1930s and early 1940s operated with the slogan "Communism is 20th century Americanism." In other words, American leftism derives its strength from an interplay between imported ideas, cherished popular American traditions, and appeals to the higher or, if need be, to the lower human appetites. Communism, socialism, welfarism, ideas from the French Revolution, or democracy are clearly importations. The anti-colonialist crusade, which has done such tremendous harm to all concerned, rests on American folklore, as far as it does not also derive some impetus from the democratic dogma, whereas Woodrow Wilson's program to make the world safe for democracy has idealistic undertones, and the sexual revolution, so dear to the non-Marxist left anywhere, appeals to baser instincts. It is in the domain of sex, below the belt, and probably in this region only, that the liberal principle has been preserved. To which one might add another biological stand, anti-racism. American leftism not only is anti-puritanical, it stands for libertinism. To what extent the defense of homosexual practices, a cause popular with the uncommitted left the world over, is due to the strong identitarian strain in leftism, will always remain an element of speculation. The American non-Marxist leftist is naturally feminist, and the leftist bent of the female feminist, the ex-suffragette type, is very marked in America. But the American leftist is not really a lover of women, and one also has to keep in mind that the American matriarchy is a myth. Women in America have a very wide ghetto in which they rule supreme, but they have neither the influence women have in France nor, of a different type, in Italy, nor in the upper layers of Central and Eastern Europe. In Spain, nay, even in misogynist England, one can imagine a ruling queen, but America could not conceivably elect a female president. A female vice president succeeding a male president? Perhaps. But a lady stumping the country? Libertinism, however, is frowned upon by the stricter leftist ideologies. Although homosexuality was not infrequent in certain Nazi circles and even had its advocates in proto-Nazi groups, it was savagely punished by the Nazi authorities. In the concentration camps, the homosexuals were assembled into punitive units with distinctive marks on their uniforms. In the Soviet Union, too, homosexuality is considered a crime, which indeed makes no sense taking into consideration the deterministic character of the official Soviet philosophy. As a matter of fact, since materialism rejects the notion of free will, why should there be any punishment for anything? Sade asked this question earlier. The American uncommitted left retains, apart from its sexual anti-Puritanism, a few humanitarian residues from its genuinely liberal ancestors. It usually has a dislike for capital punishment, though this sort of retribution was first abolished in Western civilization by the Habsburgs in Tuscany and Austria and by Catherine II in Russia. It was later temporarily reintroduced in Austria and Russia, but after 1898 Emperor Franz Joseph pardoned every culprit condemned to death, with one exception. In 1898 the Empress Elizabeth was murdered in Geneva by an Italian anarchist. Franz Joseph's practical abolition of the death penalty was a Christian reply to his own loss in a great dialogue with God. Nor was Gavrilo Princip, murderer of his nephew and heir to the throne and virtual initiator of World War I, executed. In Russia the death penalty was practically re-abolished by Alexander II, after having been once abolished by Catherine II, and remained almost in abeyance until the communists became the masters of the country. It was reserved mainly for assassinations or attempted assassinations of members of the imperial family. As a matter of fact, it is psychologically very difficult for a monarch to sign the death warrant for one of his subjects with whom he is connected in a father-son relationship. Here also lies the reason for the ready abdication of dynasties, since they cannot easily fire at their children in times of stress and revolts. In republics the situation is radically different, because the person of the magistrate is less important. The democratic republic works with abstractions, the constitution, the law, the general will, whereas monarchy is personal government. According to democratic doctrine, the citizen revolting against a duly elected government is revolting against himself. He is not a parasite, he is a suicidal maniac. He deserves no pity. Yet apart from these humanitarian leftovers, the not strictly Marxian, but usually Marx-tainted, uncommitted American leftist, the man arrogating for himself the label of liberal is by no means a friend of liberty, of personal freedom. Even when he seemingly espouses the cause of liberation and emancipation, as in the case of the American of part African ancestry, he immediately invokes the strong arm of the law, the intervention of secular government in the social domain. The net result of such ubiquitous and total legislating and intervening might then be another noble experiment such as we had in Prohibition. Here precisely lies the false liberal's radical deviation from the ideals of those liberals whom he brazenly but wrongly claims as his ancestors, in his adulation of the omnipotent state and his genuine contempt for the independent person. His real or pretended humanism in the biological domain, sex, race, death penalty, is matched by a totalitarian outlook in nearly all the others. The Russellian strain is here even more evident than the earlier and milder American leftist tradition as represented by Jefferson, Paine, Rush, and Jackson. We shall have more to say about the American pseudo-liberal later on. Here we merely want to cite a few passages from a book which was published in a moment of great fear and tension among uncommitted leftists living in the United States, i.e., after the fall of Paris in June 1940. At that time the German armies had reached the Channel and the brown heirs of the French Revolution, together with their fascist allies, were ruling all over Europe from central Poland to the Spanish border and from the North Cape to Libya. Only Sweden, Finland, Switzerland, Spain, Portugal, the Balkans, and, of course, Britain were not in their grip. The Third Reich, moreover, was intimately allied with the Soviet Union, which provided Germany with much-needed raw materials, and above all with high-octane gasoline enabling the Nazi war machine to retaliate savagely against the British air attacks. Poland was divided between two totalitarian empires, Romania had been shorn of Bessarabia with German permission, and the rape of the three Baltic republics happened with Hitler's connivance. The Soviet press sided completely with the Third Reich and Soviet foreign policy gave full support to the National Socialists. The disappointment in the left-of-center camp was great because National Socialism, especially in America, had been regarded as a rightist movement. Red Russia and Brown Germany now were in the same camp and non-totalitarian democracy was fighting with its back against the wall. Some of the American leftists hoped that their country would come to the aid of European democracy. There were also American conservative interventionists because their heart was on the side of the liberty-loving British monarchy and of the valiant Finns during the Winter War of 1939 to 1940, yet in the immediate future there was no indication that Congress would declare war against Nazi Germany, and a very large number of American leftists, in their boundless sympathy for the Soviet Union, were radically isolationist. The American Youth Congress, a Red Front organization, convening in late 1939, booed President Roosevelt because he had seemed sympathetic to the fighting Finns, but applauded Mrs. Roosevelt who, thanks to the kind ear she lent to Joseph Lash, spoke words very much to their liking. Up to the invasion of Russia there were practically no American leftist volunteers who came to the aid of Britain, although they had flocked in very great numbers to the international brigades in Spain in order to participate lustily in the greatest sadistic orgy the Western world had experienced before 1939. There were volunteers for Britain, there were people raising funds for the Finns, but those were not leftists. At this juncture the non-Marxist left in the United States went into a huddle and produced a Declaration on World Democracy, also signed by a few people who, so one would think, did not really belong to their camp. There is something exceedingly hurried about American life. There is a certain affection for publicity and little time to read full texts to which people affix their signature. Thus it happened that the book called The City of Man, a Declaration on World Democracy, was published over the names of Herbert Agar, Frank Adelot, G. A. Borges, Thomas Mann's son-in-law, Herman Brock, Ada L. Comstock, Dorothy Canfield Fisher, Christian Gauss, Oscar Yazzie, Alvin Johnson, Thomas Mann, Louis Mumford, William Allen Nielsen, and Gaetano Salvemini. But it also bore the signature of William Yandell Elliott, Hans Kohn, and Reinhold Niebuhr. Especially in the case of Niebuhr I had great doubts that he saw the complete text. The small book has a declaration, a proposal and, finally, a note as to the origin of the document, and a real document when it is. The note informs us that a group of friends began meeting in October 1938 and that they drew up a memorandum in May 1939. A letter of invitation for a committee on Europe was drafted and mailed on March 28, 1940. This letter was signed by G. A. Borges, Robert M. Hutchins, Thomas Mann, Louis Mumford, William A. Nielsen, and Reinhold Niebuhr. The first conference of the committee was held May 24 to 26 in Atlantic City. Further meetings took place in Sharon, Connecticut, on August 24 and 25, 1940. There the final drafts of the book were made. It is significant that though new members lined up, Mr. Robert M. Hutchins dropped out. He was too shrewd to put his name to a text about which the late Father Walter Farrell, O.P., then a leading Thomist in the United States, commented quite rightly, "This book represents one of the earliest and most concrete conquests of Hitlerism in America." The declaration and the proposal are also interesting because they still use the term liberal in its classic context, yet they defend a clearly illiberal, or anti-liberal, totalitarian democracy quite in the Jacobin tradition. The language in which this document is written is distinctly of an extreme leftist character and, whereas socialism is mentioned, something here to stay, and as organically pertaining to the Janus head of democracy, communism gets only a few snide side remarks. Monopoly capitalism and the ruling classes, however, get it really in the neck. The book merits special attention because it expresses its message in ringing terms and openly identifies democracy with religion, presenting it as a religion. According to the signers, it is the plenitude of heart service to a highest religion embodying the essence of all higher religions. Democracy is nothing more and nothing less than humanism in theocracy and rational theocracy in universal humanism. Involuntarily the remarks of R. H. Gabriel and Crane Brinton come to one's mind, that owing to its irrational unscientific character the only chance of survival for democracy is its metamorphosis into a religion. The signers are kind enough to find some virtues in the higher religions and indeed very exalted ones in the faith founded by Jesus, highest of the Jewish prophets, but democracy is the highest all-embracing religion which is a universal religion of the Spirit acknowledges with reverence the incorruptible substance of truth which lies under the surface and errors of the separate confessions risen from the common ground of ancient and medieval civilization. Democracy, in the Catholicity of its language, interprets and justifies the separate creeds as its own vernaculars. In other words, as long as the Catholic, Lutheran, Eastern or Anglican theologies talk the jargon of Democrates, they will be tolerated. Democracy in the meantime will practice a severe and eclectic benevolence towards these slightly obsolete denominations. Democracy explains and annexes all dogmas as symbols. How this is done we discover in a passage which reads, "The fundamental principle is that the democratic concept of freedom can never include the freedom to destroy democracy and freedom. If no liberty is granted to the murderer and arsonist, no liberty can be granted to whosoever and whatsoever threaten the divine spirit in man and above man." This is, in an interpretation suited to modern man, the Spirit which Christ called the Holy Ghost. This seems to take care of the whole theology concerning the Holy Trinity by infallible deduction, not from the Vatican but from the White House, because we also read, the religion of the Holy Ghost, and nothing else, is the Spirit of the New Testament of which the President of the United States spoke. This universal religion, harbored in the best minds of our age, this common prayer of democracy militant, was anticipated by sages and saints of all ages. Its substance matured out of whatever rose highest in man's speculations and hopes. One wonders who these sages and saints were, certainly not Dante, St. Thomas Aquinas, Shakespeare, Milton, Calvin, Luther, Nicholas of Cusa, Goethe, St. Ignatius, or Kierkegaard. The Enlightenment, naturally, fares quite well. Hence, after enumeration of the virtues and foibles of the Christian and Jewish faiths, we get the statement that, finally, the optimistic philosophies of enlightenment which provided a background for America's Declaration of Independence, postulated the primal goodness and nobility of man as a myth conducive to his final nobility and goodness. This sentence is heartening in at least one respect: it declares a myth the Russellian concept of good and noble man. The Catholic Church, as one might expect, comes in for a great deal of criticism, and one is amused to hear that the allegiance of Catholic Christians to the city of God, not, for a change, to the city of man, must be disentangled from bondage to Vatican City as a foreign potentate in feud or trade with other potentates. And with the foreign potentate we come clearly to the language of the Know-Nothing movement. The future is reserved almost exclusively to the super-religion of democracy. There is no return to the spiritual fleshpots of the past. We shall not imitate the backward course of Julian the Apostate, or of the Roman populace running for asylum and atonement to the old gods after the capture of their city by the Goths. We shall not return, under the counsel of despair, from a higher and vaster religion to lesser ones. The higher and vaster religion is not symbolized by the cross and the Lamb that bears the sins of the world, not by baptism of water, not by Mount Sinai and Mount Tabor and Mount Carmel, not by the Torah and the Gospels, the Lord's Prayer and the Nicene Creed, but by the click of the voting machines behind the green curtains, by the swish of the guillotine, by the ghastly tragicomedy of the storming of the Bastille, and even more so by the nauseating massacres in the Vendée. It is obvious that under these circumstances the religion of democracy takes precedence over all the other creeds of lesser breeds, and that therefore they ought to be placed under surveillance. The proposal tells us bluntly that too much separation between church and state is not good and that certain controls of religion are quite in order. The hour has struck when we must know what limits are set by the religion of freedom, which is democracy, to the freedom of worship. As symbols of the religion of freedom one might mention Socrates and the cup, Le Mans and the Noieties, the hunger blockade of 1918, Dresden, and Hiroshima. For this purpose an inquisitorial investigation is necessary in order to determine what religious and ethical traditions are of greater or lesser value for the preservation and growth of the democratic principle. An inquiry into the religious heritage of the Western world should try to discover which of its elements are more apt to cooperate with the democratic community and consequently more deserving of protection and help by it, and whether other elements, conversely, are by their nature and content committed to the support of fascism and other autocratic philosophies and intrinsically so inimical to democracy, or at least so ambiguous, as to become a source of additional danger in the hour of peril. A careful reading of the book shows that neither the Foursquare Gospel Church nor the Mennonites nor the Assembly of God is meant by these oblique references. It is primarily the same international church, run by a foreign potentate, which the National Socialists also had singled out for their most violent attacks, and in the second place the church founded by Martin Luther, without whom the Reformation as we know it, would never have taken place. It is comforting to know that Rome and Wittenberg, though Geneva less so, draw the common ire of American and German identitarian leftists, not to mention the masters of the Kremlin. As we can clearly see, there is no burning love for real freedom among the signers of this noble declaration. This is proved partly by their repeated attacks against liberalism and against the freedom of religion, as well as by their desire to amalgamate all higher religions into vernaculars of democracy, the new state religion. This new religion was also to have a ritual, an unsectarian liturgy for which university and college chapel services and exercises provide a provisional model. Here we are very near to the worship of Robespierre's supreme being in colorful ceremonies and perhaps equally near to the efforts of the Nazis to establish a national church by forcefully amalgamating Lutherans, Calvinists, and Catholics into a folkish and de-Judaized Christianity, which would supplant pity and charity with heroism and other ancient Germanic virtues. Hitler tried to start the process of unification by appointing bishops in Germany's Lutheran Church. There were none since the Reformation, and while many a pastor donned a brown shirt, the best minds in the evangelical church started to protest and to band together in the Bekennenskirche, professing church. These men, who met for the first time at Barmen, refused to see in their church a vernacular of National Socialism. One might take in one stride the book's constant socialistic propaganda and the remarks to the effect that a planned economy is implicit in the spirit of democracy. More total and totalitarian are the visions of a world state with a rather amusing nationalistic undertone. Of all fading fatherlands, one brotherland will be made, the city of man, and that the United States must be made the Uniting States. No number is prescribed to the stars on its flag. It is nice to think that the signers had a vision of the coming world state with the United States as its Piedmont, its stepping stone, that they craved a global state representing a greater America. This would not be so terribly bad if this greater United States were loosely federated and not strictly centralized. Yet the language we hear provides us with a rather different impression. The day comes when the heresy of nationalism is conquered. Then above the teeming manifold life of free communities, there will be a universal parliament representing peoples, not states, a fundamental body of law prevailing throughout the planet in all those matters that involve interregional interests. An elected president, the president of mankind, no crowned emperor, no hereditary king. Embodying for a limited term the common authority and the common law, and a federal force ready to strike at anarchy and felony. This sounds grim. The president of mankind may be Julian Felsenberg out of Robert Hugh Benson's Lord of the World. On top of it we have the federal forces ready to strike everywhere. Thus if anybody were to challenge the dictatorship of humanity, p. 34, in the name of God, or perhaps only in the name of personal freedom, the federal forces would collar him. One has to read a bit between the lines in order to guess the total and totalitarian character of the religion of democracy. I will help the reader by emphasizing certain words in the following passages with italics. In the decline of Western civilization, the collective purpose of democracy, with its commandments of discipline and loyalty, had given way to a corrupted liberalism with its claim of unrestricted liberty for each one to act as he pleased. The concept of a vital democracy must be dissociated from the notion of a disintegrated liberalism. There is, indeed, no liberty but one, the right, which is a duty, of making oneself and others free through absolute allegiance to the final goal of man. All other liberties are the rewards of battle. There is no comfort but one, pride in the duty performed. Democracy must be dogmatized, it must be redefined. It should be no longer the conflicting concourse of uncontrolled individual impulses, but a harmony subordinated to a plan, no longer a dispersive atomism, but a purposeful organism. Here we have clearly another case of African democracy for the white man, of Mr. Sukarno's directed democracy. Democracy, according to the signers, teaches that everything must be within humanity, nothing outside humanity. This viewpoint results automatically in either atheism or in a modified pantheism. Here we have Rousseau, Robespierre, Marx, Lenin, and Hitler rolled into one. In the City of Man we see quite clearly the 13-point program of American pseudo-liberalism behind whose mask hides the not strictly Marxian left. And here are the points. 1. Utopianism. Some sort of salvation for all lies in the future. The Great Promise refers not to the theistic heaven but to a coming age of man, or Mr. Henry Wallace's Century of the Common Man. 2. Planning, which is implicit in the spirit of democracy. It begins with economic planning, continues with social engineering, and finally produces planned elections. Man no longer has the primacy, he is made subordinate to the plan. In the end we have the total victory of geometry and arithmetic on the human level. Man as a cipher is the end of man. 3. Centralization as opposed to local rights and privileges. The rule is supreme, there are no exceptions, no privileges, no deviations, no planning is possible without centralization, and there is no utopia without planning. Utopia will come automatically, yet we have to plan for it, an inner contradiction without solution and present in all leftist creeds. Free will is rejected as a dangerous fiction. If it existed it would have to be respected, and there is little freedom. Individualism would become a term of abuse, because it interferes with the blueprints guaranteeing the foreseeable. 4. Identity, sameness. The masses, humanity, consist of identical units of mere individuals, exchangeable grains of sands, not persons. To be different, to think or act differently, becomes a crime. Where differences exist, they are declared to be meaningless. Where they cannot be explained away and when they cause trouble to the plan, they call for enforced standardization, expropriation, demotion, exile, and, in the more extreme cases, execution, measures, to be sure, which could not yet be taken. But they are encouraged abroad where all leveling movements and actions get the full sympathy and encouragement of the local left. 5. Majoritism. There are minorities, never majorities, who are obnoxious and are declared to be the real cause of all or at least most iniquities. These conspiratorial and domineering minorities are not content to be like everybody else, they crave privileges, thus depriving the underprivileged of their rights, they destroy equality, identity and social harmony. The main criminals are the ruling classes composed in the United States of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant minority, of the Catholic hierarchy, anti-Zionist Jews, big industrialists, brass hats, bankers, and ultra-conservative rightists, a rather motley crowd. In other countries, the minorities forming objects of leftist hatreds are noblemen, Jewish newspaper owners, Armenians, modern artists, lawyers, clerical politicians, stockbrokers, etc. Leftist ideologies rest on the existence of bad men who can be made objects of general hatred. 6. The hostility against organized religion. The standard leftist reaction to religion, as long as it does not bow to the leftist establishment in humble subservience and permit itself to be infected with leftist ideas, is the effort to eliminate it from the marketplace, from all public life. Leftist forces in other climes act differently, their extreme separationism is supplanted by complete state control. 7. The socialist hatred for free enterprise, anti-capitalism, because a free economy puts a premium on hard work, thrift, and ambition, the natural enemies of equality. A free economy gives man the chance to build up a little fortress of his own, to escape state omnipotence. State welfarism is just one more means of firmly establishing state control over the citizenry. 8. Closely connected with this attitude is anti-familism. The family as a closed and emotionally marked-off unit is an obstacle to total sameness and contains a hierarchic element, authority, domination, which the leftist with his hatred of the father image thoroughly dislikes. Dynasties of all sorts are a special target for leftist attacks. The inheritance of fortunes and all other forms of the accumulation of wealth, regardless of how it is used, must be prevented by the jealous and envious state with a system of progressive taxation. All attitudes, all laws and regulations designed to protect the family and sex, its root, morally are ridiculed and rejected. The only element inherited from a liberal past is the American leftist's indifference to man's biological views and behavior patterns. While prone to deny it, he is in all other domains a subtle or even shameless authoritarian. 9. Intolerance. Inflexible principles must be stated in a renovated law, beyond which freedom is felony. City of Man, p. 77. Genuine liberalism stands for freedom and tolerance. American leftism wants freedom only for the different shades of the liberal establishment and thus carried out on a social basis a kind of internal inquisition, especially so in the intellectual field, universities, colleges, stage, film industry, radio, television, publishing, press, administration. 10. Allied with this attitude is statism, which characterizes leftism perhaps more than anything else. When the designers of the City of Man accuse the teachers of totalitarian philosophy of proclaiming, everything within the state, nothing against the state, nothing outside the state, they merely want to divert our attention. And it is the state at the highest level, in its most centralized aspect, that the American leftists worship, i.e., the federal government. 11. Linked with utopianism is Messianism, which more often than not has not a personal but rather a racial or national character. The vision of the signers who see the world state as global scale United States shows what a provincial role they assign to the American people, or rather, to the American government. Their collective Messianism is twofold. Not only is the American Republic pressed into the role of a messiah but also democracy, the ancient hope of man, p. 28. Democracy rests, according to this text, on the common prayer of democracy militant, which must be the hymn of democracy triumphant, p. 36. We have here, no doubt, an analogy to Comte's positivism, which was a secularized version of the institutionalized Catholic faith. 12. Anti-Colonialism. This Messianism has the task of eventually saving all mankind, but in the meantime it must be the savior of the colonialized nations and tribes. Thus anti-colonialism forms part and parcel of the American leftist creed. 13. Interventionism. Finally, there exists, last but not least due to utopianism and Messianism, a highly aggressive interventionist and bellicose element in American leftism which, however, is not serving genuine American interests but those of the great leftist ideologies, provided they bear the official leftist stamp. The American leftist indeed is not pledged to pacifism. Peace at any price is peace at the price of submission, the signers of the City of Man, p. 22, explain to us bluntly. Such statements, to be sure, become invalid if America is menaced by distinctly leftist powers of the international brand. Then the better read than dead formula is only too frequently appealed to. Yet holy wars against reactionaries, be they real ones or merely competitors of other leftist groups, are quite within the American, and frequently the British, leftist program. As a matter of fact, leftists usually love armed conflicts because during modern wars the state necessarily has to take liberal emergency measures. Leftists always hope that wartime policies will be made permanent. Their ideal is the secular monastery or the civilian barracks. All these 13 points, needless to say, are as characteristic of the leftist outlook in English-speaking countries as they are of the ideologies animating the French Revolution and its evil offsprings, socialism, National Socialism and communism. They have nothing to do with the convictions of men and women called liberals in the rest of the civilized world. And it must also be added that the leftist outlook in America and Britain has hardly changed since 1940 when this rather unique manifesto was published. In America, we must admit, there is today a highly increased emphasis on racial equality. Yet leftist anti-racism, it must be borne in mind, is of a very different character than that of the genuine right. And the same is true of the leftist stand towards ethnic nationality. Leftism with its strongly identitarian bent and a non-spiritual, materialistic enthusiasm either declares race and nationality to be supreme values to which everybody has to conform, as the Nazis did, or they want to explain them away and ignore them with iron determination. Because they are an obstacle to identitarian uniformity. The Nazis wanted to eliminate by brute force those who did not racially conform, those nationally, ethnically not conforming by cultural high-pressure methods. The international leftists wants us to close our eyes and ignore facts. This is just another process of elimination. The rightist, who is a liberal in the genuine sense of the term, keeps his eyes open and gladly and charitably accepts the diversity of mankind. Rejecting egalitarianism, no less than identitarianism, he knows that God's gifts are distributed in mysterious ways, not only among persons but also among nations and races. Though they cannot be expressed in a simple scientific formula and never work out mathematically in time or space, they do not invalidate the rightist principle of suum cuique.